All right, we're going to pick up a little bit right there on the listing agreements, and we were talking about purchase agreements and on title work, ordering title work. Obviously, title work is something that you guys want to think about, and you guys have now been in the business a while. Have you guys had the opportunity to list title or order? And typically, how are you ordering it? Are you guys ordering it when you list or when you get an offer? Or do we know?
So far for me, I've done it when I list. I'm sure it's clear.
They call that a TBD because you don't name the buyer. The title company wants to run a search on the seller and the buyer to make sure there's no outstanding judgments against either one of those. So when you run a title work, when you list the property, obviously you don't know who the buyer is, so you put under the buyer section, you put TBD, which is to be determined, because they're not going to run that course. They're not going to run that. All they're going to do is run the seller side of it and the property. Where's most of the problems going to come up with? I just had one the other day where we listed the property. It's the deal I'm getting ready to close here at the end of the month. We listed the property, and when we listed it, the guy, and who's been a friend of mine for 40 years, told me what his payoff was. And I said, okay, well, we're going to run title work, mainly because I'd been having some meetings with Chicago Title, and I told her I'd give her a little bit of business to help her out. So she ran the title, and it came back. He had 5 judgments against him because he had filed a bankruptcy like in 02 or 03. And some of those companies that filed didn't drop off. So we had to spend about 3 weeks dealing with those companies and getting letters written, and his attorney had to write a letter to that company's attorney to get the release so he could send it to the title company. On the bright side is that whole time we were still showing the house and hadn't had an offer on it, and it just, I don't know, maybe it was just good timing, but miraculously, like the day we got the 3 or 4 leases released, we had a showing the next day, and they wrote an offer, and now we're set to close, so it's going to come up really clean. But if we'd have waited to run his title the day we got the offer, we'd have been screwed. We'd have not been able to close in time. In his particular case, closing is a big issue because he's got a job going to Arkansas. So he's closing like on February the 29th and starts a new job in Arkansas on like March the 12th. So we could have been in a big world of hurt. So we ordered that, and I got lucky. Got lucky that I did it that way. Normally I used to do is purchase agreements when we got to purchase, because now the buyers have the right to come in and, you know, order their title work, and they want to check the box saying buyers order the title work. And the problem that you have now is if you do the TBD, buyer checks that back on the purchase agreement, and they take the title out of your company's hands. You know, they've done some work and not theoretically going to get paid for it. Which, you know, I guess that we all understand that problem happens, but what ends up happening is that sales rep comes to your office eventually and goes, hey, you know, Raymond, we've ordered work 3 or 4 times now, haven't closed, so you better get involved in that. The other option is you could always run 2 title companies. You guys know that? Yeah. It becomes a real big pain in the butt. You could run your title company and do the owner's policy when you list it and you order. When you list the property, they'll run a TBD. The buyer then writes an offer and says, we want to use our title company. You actually can say, okay, but we're staying here. So you go get the lender's policy from Security Title, and we'll keep our policy here. It becomes a real big pain in the butt, because then those 2 title companies have to talk. And when you close, you end up with 2 closers. You know, it's almost like a husband and wife. They can't talk to each other, so they got 2 people telling them what to do. The one tells the husband, one tells the wife. That's why I've seen it happen. You know, the person sits at the head of the table and closes. There were actually 2 of them sitting at the head of the table. One dealt with this side, one dealt with that side. You know, it was a real pain. The other big problem is when you guys write a policy, then they do the other side. You know it's called a simultaneous policy, right? And there's a discount for it. It's like when the seller goes to Chicago Title and orders his owner's policy, he's going to pay a policy price based on the coverage of the house. The buyer's going to come in and use the same company. They will write what's called a simultaneous policy. Because literally, I don't know, are you one of those guys that's half glass or half full? They've already done the title search. All they have to do is change the name. So typically, you know, your policy, average on a $100,000 house, about $500. But the simultaneous policy is only about $175 because they've already done some of the work. All right? If you go to two companies, you do not get that price break. So the lender's policy is going to be $500, and the owner's policy is going to be $500. All right? So you do get an advantage to staying at one. They write one policy and then they do the simultaneous policy. Whereas if you have two title companies, they actually will charge you both because, hey, we got to send our searcher down and get paid. This one's going, well, we're going to send our searcher down and get paid. And you hope they come back with the same answers, which theoretically they probably should. And the time frame, I don't know what title work is now, 3 or 4 days, unless they find something, so you got to be prepared for the time frame. One of the other things that becomes important on your purchase agreement is taxes. Most of the time we prorate taxes. We went through that big rigmarole, when they went to the 1, 2, 3%. It was very common in that 1 year time frame where they started saying, okay, we want you to pay the next year's taxes. That's how we were making up for it rather than prorating. And in Indiana, remember, we are one of only like 5 states that run in arrears. You guys understand how that whole process works. You know, we're paying May of 2016 for taxes of November 14 to May of 15. So we're paying a whole year in arrears. And that's always fun when you're dealing with a title company out of state, because a lot of them don't understand. Like Florida calls us all the time on bank-owned homes, and they're like, you guys haven't paid the taxes in almost 2 years? Well, technically 1 year, because we run a year behind, and they're like, what? Oh, you're one of those states. Yeah. So they always have to work that out.
Florida's not like that, I take it.
No, Florida is not like that. If you ever deal with, Ohio's not like that. A lot of the 2 big banks that we used to deal with, or that I had several dealings on bank-owned homes, they used title companies out of Florida and one out of Cincinnati, and both of those banks were like, oh, crap. We have to understand how this whole thing works out. One of the other things they wanted us to talk about was being current. Obviously, even being current's a year behind. So one of the things you need to remember to tell your client, as a seller, they have got at least 1 year of taxes to pay for. When you guys go and talk to your seller and you're trying to give them the net to seller sheet, you guys use the net to seller sheet, and you tell your seller you're going to have at least a year of taxes. I mean, if you paid your taxes on the way to the closing table, you still owe a year. If you failed, you may owe a year and a half. And if you're delinquent, you could owe 2 years of taxes when you close. So always remember that you have to count that into your seller's net to seller sheet, because they don't realize, oh, I owe $1,000 and I got to pay a commission. How come I got so little? Well, yeah, you had almost 2 years of taxes to catch up on. That's if you prorate it to the day of closing, which is 99.9% of all the closings we do now.
Why would someone agree to not do that?
Well, when they went from whatever tax base they were using, that mythical thing, to that 1%, there were a lot of houses, like in Broad Ripple, that taxes jumped from like $50 a year to like $800 a year because they readjusted based on the current value of the market. So when the new buyer was coming in, he was expecting to pay $50 a year, but because they were doing this new market value thing, his taxes would go from 50 to like 800. So what they were doing was, as part of the negotiation, they were asking that person to pay the next year's taxes instead of me having to come in and make up $700 or $1,500 over for the 2 years of taxes.
But now that we've been through that, why is it still really even an option?
Yeah.
Why would that benefit anybody?
The only reason it would, we still use that market value kind of concept. It would still potentially benefit from somebody like my mom. If my mom sold her house, it was appraised in 74. She's lived there 40 years. So her taxes definitely would be different than if you bought my mom's house. So that big a spread, she's not had hers readjusted, could be a big spread. You might ask her, hey, I want you to pay the taxes. I've not seen it done in probably 4 years, though. Most everybody just checks that.
Someone asked for that, and we're like, are you joking?
Yeah. Well, that was probably why. They wanted you to. Was it a house that the seller had been living in a while?
I think it was an investment property maybe that they were looking at. Like they had.
Well, see.
And they had gutted it, but hadn't put anything back in it.
And an investment property, though, would be a different percentage, too. Because it's 1% for owner-occupied, 2% for investment, and 3% for commercial. So there would be a different price structure that would cause the buyer to now have to pay more taxes that first year. Because remember, with us recording the taxes, if there's no homeowner exemption, which, by the way, maybe we should talk about exemption. If there's no homeowner's exemption on that property, when the new buyer comes in, not for a year, though, because the way they record it. So when they prorate like today to the middle of February, and the new buyer takes it, he's not getting taxes until 2017 now. So all of 2018's taxes are going to be higher than he was counting on. So he may ask the seller to pay for those. So because it's the seller's fault, there was no homeowner's exemption on there. So that's another good reason. If you're gaining an exemption that's not there, that first year, you're not going to get it. How many different exemptions do we have? What do we have? 7? 5? 7? Typically, there's only 3 that I know of. You've got the mortgage exemption, which is $2,000. We've got the homestead exemption, which is up to $45,000. Then I know there is some handicap exemptions, like the blind, I think, has an exemption. And I think there's an exemption if you put more than $20,000 of rehab into the house. Does anybody know that to be a fact?
The one that we ran into is we had a retired veteran, and his property taxes were ridiculously low.
Yeah.
And people looked at the house, got all excited, and said, hang on a second, because I guarantee he's getting some exemptions.
Yeah.
And because he was a disabled vet.
Yeah, I think that's another exemption.
There was all kinds of exemptions, and their taxes basically were going to be almost $1,200 higher than what they had before.
Yeah.
Because they wanted those exemptions.
You guys have to keep that in mind when you're dealing with the selling side or the buyer, as common people would call it. That, like you said, your buyer coming in and looks at the price of that house and does the math and goes, oh, it's going to be $1,200. I can afford that a month. You've got to make sure you look at it and go, oh, well, it was last assessed in 94. If it gets assessed again now, your taxes could be higher because it was assessed at $28,000. You're buying it at $170. That assessment's going to move up to the market value, which means your taxes are going to move up. So your $1,200 house payment is actually going to be $1,650.
Would that work in the reverse if it was a situation like we had with the market crash where the values
But you have to go in and prove that. And the best way to prove that, and there were people that were doing that, were going in and saying, look, you got the house assessed at 180, I just paid 160. The best proof is to show them the purchase agreement and say, here, Mr. Assessor, here's the proof that my house is now 180, all right? Now, there were they're going to that market value, but they're also taking into consideration what they call non-traditional sales. So like if you bought a HUD home for 12 grand in a neighborhood of 180, you can bank-owned homes, foreclosure, short sales, HUD homes, VA repos, all of those are definition to an. You couldn't get, they would actually raise your assessment up to the market value. Even though you paid 120, yeah, it's going to be assessed at 140 because you got a deal. It was not a normal house. So you always want it to be assessed lower, but make sure, what's the old saying, when you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And like Dave said, you get a house that's assessed really low and the new buyer comes in, make sure he understands that, oh, I've been underpaying on taxes all this time. You may get dinged on it.
Now, the example you gave to begin with, though, which is stuff that we all went into, if you somebody buys a house that is empty, so there's no homestead credit, or yeah. Don't they go ahead and calculate that in if you're having your taxes taken out in escrow? Don't they have it figured for the hire?
I am not a lender,
Okay.
so I don't know. You would think they would be smart enough to do that, but here's the only problem. If they did that, and let's say you forgot or missed or just decided you weren't going to, then they've undercalculated the amount of taxes to take out. It could put you in a situation come tax time where you're in a deficit of what you really owe. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, but that, in the reverse of that, if they calculate it at the higher tax, and then you get your homestead credit
Well,
filed, then your payments are going down.
well, let's go back to another rule that I don't know if you guys know, the one I just happen to know. Remember Section 8 of RESPA, or Section 10 of RESPA that says they can only take out so much money? Remember we was talking about that? Everybody shake your head, yes. Section 10 of RESPA, one of the things that changed, that the lender can only take out a certain number now to start your escrow account. Remember that rule? There's actually a mathematical equation based on the current taxes. It's 1/4 of the annual taxes plus 1/2 of 1/4 for safety. So it's like 3/8. But they base that calculation on the current taxes. And that's why you end up with people that get into a deficit when the tax goes up, like in a situation like that, where the taxes go up, they lose their homestead or something and the tax goes up. Now they've got it running a deficit and they end up giving a call going, hey, you still owe me another $300 for taxes.